Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and this is our Murders at KARLOV Manor set review. We've already done white, blue, black, and red. This is the last of the monocolor videos for the set review. This is green, and after that we'll get to colorless and then multicolored. So let's dive right in. Starting here with Aftermath Analyst. This is a 1/3 elf detective for 1 green and 1. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards, and you can pay 1 green and 3 and sacrifice the analyst to return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So, first of all, in Limited, this is going to be a nice little blocker early, and it's going to fit pretty well into the Collect Evidence archetype. What's cool about this card is you can start surveilling, self-milling, that sort of thing for your Collect Evidence cards, but then, because your lands aren't able to be used as part of Collect Evidence, they're just sitting there in your graveyard being wasted, but later in the game, Aftermath Analyst can be sacked to get all of those lands back. So a little bit of extra value there when you're in that kind of an archetype, and you should probably take that into consideration when potentially coming across them in draft. As far as constructed, I do feel like there are some interesting combos that could lead to a deck that makes use of this card. It's worth noting that this can get you a whole bunch of landfall triggers all at once for something like Tatiova, or plenty of other landfall cards, but even Tatiova is in standard right now. So something like that could benefit from this, and it can benefit even more if you're using the new Capenna sack lands, because you'll get double the landfall triggers, and it's really easy to make sure those sack lands end up in your graveyard, because just playing them puts them in their graveyard, puts them in your graveyard after they're done. So I think there's some value there. I think there might be a way to make a crazy new landfall deck in standard, maybe even some wilder things in older constructed formats. So this guy is definitely one to keep your eye on. Next up, we've got Airtight Alibi, 1 green and 2 for an enchantment aura with flash. It enchants a creature. When it enters, you untap the enchanted creature. You give it hexproof until end of turn. If it's suspected, it's no longer suspected. An enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and can't become suspected. So this does a whole lot for just 1 common card. It is a little expensive at 3 mana. But at instant speed, being able to save your guy with hexproof is pretty decent. And then getting a little bit of edge value on top of that, being able to untap the creatures so that you can block an incoming attacker when they don't see it coming, and maybe blow them out as a combat trick. Being able to take away the suspected state so that if it's not able to block, it actually is able to block now, is also pretty cool. And just having +2/+2 is nice, but then if your opponent's using suspected creatures or cards in their deck that can make things suspected, this thing can no longer be targeted by those. It can't become suspected again, which means they can't force it to not be able to block, which can be really important in certain decks. So this does a lot for just 3 mana, and I can't help but think that it's got to have a home as a 22nd, 23rd card or something like that in Limited. Moving on, we've got a Killer Among Us. This is 1 green and 4 for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 white human creature token, a 1/1 blue merfolk creature token, and a 1/1 red goblin creature token. Then you secretly choose human, merfolk, or goblin, and at any point in time, you can sacrifice a Killer Among Us and reveal the chosen creature type. And if target attacking creature token is the chosen type, you put 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and it gains Death Touch until end of turn. This card's really cool. It does a lot of different things, but I worry that at the end of the day, 5 mana is just a little bit too much. But that being said, it gives you 4 permanents as soon as it comes into play. The enchantment itself and 3 different creature tokens. There's got to be a way to abuse that, right? And then the fact that any attacking creature at all that is the chosen type, any creature token. So if you're using creature tokens of some of these creature types, aside from just a Killer Among Us, if you're getting those tokens from other means, this has more versatility and things it can target and put those +1/+1 counters on. And the Death Touch could matter too. So there's a little bit of a higher ceiling there depending on what you're putting this in. it's pretty interesting. It's also worth noting that things that are going to double tokens, like a Mondrak or something like that, is going to give you way more off of something like this. Since you're getting 3 different tokens off this, you're going to end up with 6 tokens, which is kind of gnarly. But at the end of the day, it is still 5 mana, and I don't really know if 5 mana is worth it. I think in Limited, it will be, because getting a 4/4 and 2 1/1s, and also the shenanigans as far as combat tricks and stuff for when that creature does become a 4/4 and getting the death touch. So, I mean, a 4/4 and 2 1/1s plus a bunch of, like, combat trick upside seems pretty good for 5 mana. So, I'm going to go out on a limb and say for Limited, this card's actually going to be really good. It happens to be in green, which is the color for ramp, so it's a lot easier to hit that 5 mana. So, I think this might actually be a lot better than it looks for Limited specifically. It might even be a sleeper. Keep your eye on it. Next up, we've got Analyze the Pollen. It's our first rare of the day. 1 green for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, you may collect Evidence 8, but you don't have to. You search your library for a basic land card. If evidence was collected, instead you search your library for a creature or a non-basic, well, it could be a basic still, but any land card at all, doesn't have to be a basic. Reveal that card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. Pretty interesting here. If you get it early and you just don't have a turn 1 play, you can just fetch the basic you need to color fix, to make sure you have another land so that you're not missing a land drop, that kind of thing. But then, like, if you top deck another one later in the game and you have the 8 evidence, you can just play it to fetch your best creature or a very particular special, you know, like rare non-basic land that maybe your deck is built around, like maybe in older formats like a Field of the Dead or something like that. So could do some pretty cool stuff for only 1 mana, and the fact that it is only 1 mana is what makes me want to really kind of keep my eye on this. But at the end of the day, collect Evidence 8 is a lot. It is an awful lot. So I don't know if you're consistently plan A, just using this to fetch a land for 1 mana, I don't know how good that is. I think plan A does have to be to get that creature, with plan B just being fetch a land if you're in a bind, you know? And I'm not sure how easy it will be to get to collect Evidence 8 for that. That being said, in Limited, this is a slam dunk because it's going to find you your 1 bomb creature that you can just use to take over the game, even if you have to wait a little while to finally cast this thing until you get enough evidence in the yard. Next up, we've got Archdruid's Charm. I misread this one when I first saw it, and it's actually better than it looks. So 3 green for an instant, you get to choose 1 ability. Search your library for a creature or land card, reveal it, put it onto the battlefield tapped if it's a land, otherwise put it into your hand and then shuffle. Or put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. Or exile target artifact or enchantment. Now, the versatility here of the different things you can do with this is what makes it especially powerful. And normally the charms aren't super powerful as far as any one particular mode, and they make up for that by having that versatility of getting to choose different things based on what the game is like that you're in right now, what the current board state is, and that versatility is usually what makes them so strong. And we still have that versatility here with Archdruid's Charm, but each mode is a lot more powerful than we would normally see in a charm because of that really difficult to acquire triple green and the cost. Being able to just incidentally exile a Balmy artifact or enchantment if we happen to have to use this for that, stapled to a card that, if we don't need to do that, can just be straight up removal while putting a counter on our creature. Those 2 modes alone are pretty good at instant speed. You got to remember, this is instant speed, so you can really blow out your opponent if you use it correctly. But that first mode is deceptively good because you can find any land, not just a basic land. So, for example, if you're playing a landfall deck with something like a Tatyova, you could search for a New Capenna sack land. It immediately comes into the battlefield tapped, but then sacks itself and you find another land. So you get 2 landfall triggers off of this at instant speed. that happening at instant speed could be make or break. We usually don't see instant speed when it comes to ramp of this quality. It's normally sorcery, or if it is instant speed, it's a lot less quality ramp, right? But this is pretty good considering we're not just stuck with basics. So having something like that stapled to those other two modes that are going to be absolutely great under the right circumstances just makes this card really good, even though it is kind of tricky to use. It might be a trap in limited, because the triple green is kind of nuts. But if you can go mostly green without much downside, getting access to this card in limited is going to be pretty nutty, so maybe it's possible. Next up, we've got Audience with Trostani. 1 green and 2 for a sorcery. You create a 0/1 green plant creature token, and then you draw cards equal to the number of differently named creature tokens you control. For 3 mana, being able to draw potentially a ton of cards is kind of nutty. This works really well with another green plant creature that we'll see later. Plant creature token generator that we'll see later in the multicolor review when we get to that. But it's also just really good in a random token deck. If you're running tokens with like Wedding Announcement and 3 Blind Mice and whatever, it's pretty easy to cast this a little bit later in the game, like turn 5 or turn 6, and just draw 3, 4, even 5 cards off of it, while also making a 0/1 dork for just that 3 mana, and that can absolutely just gas up your hand and keep you going. So it'll be interesting to see if we can build some kind of crazy token themed deck that uses a lot of different token generators and not necessarily like all within the same tribe, so that we can get as much value off of a card like this as possible. And I do love the fact that it gives you just that 1/0/1 dork body along with it, so no matter what, you're getting a body and drawing a card, but the ceiling is just super high. Next up, we've got Axebane Ferox. This guy is an absolute beast, a questing beast at home. 4/4, Death Touch, Haste for 2 green and 2. Does this sound familiar? It should. But this time it has Ward Collect Evidence 4. And that makes it really interesting. That means if they want to target Axebane Ferox, they have to exile 4 mana cost worth of cards from their own graveyard in order to do it. Now, you can run this alongside things like Graveyard Trespasser, and other just really good aggressive cards that are able to exile things from your opponent's graveyard. If you can consistently exile things from your graveyard, you can keep forcing your opponent to be, you know, too far away from that Collect Evidence 4 to actually be able to do it. If you can constantly exile enough stuff out of their yard, they can never get to the 4 that they need in order to actually target this thing. And I find that kind of funny. You're able to sort of turn this into hexproof if you play it appropriately in the right deck, and it's going to be interesting to try to brew that. I think that's one of the brews we're going to try and do for sure. But another way this can be used to blow out your opponent is if you have a way of exiling their graveyard at instant speed. You can not even be preemptive, right? You can wait until they try to target this with removal, and in response remove their graveyard. Well, now you let the ward resolve, they can't collect evidence for, and their spell fizzles. So not only can you basically give this guy hexproof, but you can force them to waste a removal spell as well. So some really cool stuff you can do with this guy, and I think it's going to be pretty gnarly in the right decks that are able to really deny your opponent's graveyard. Very aggressive beastie boy. Very, very cool. Next up, we've got Bite Down on Crime. Scruff McGruff, looking good. 1 green and 3 for a sorcery. Sorcery? It's about time for a coffee break. For a sorcery, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may collect evidence 6, and this spell costs 2 less to cast if evidence was collected. So it's only a 2 mana spell if you have enough stuff to exile out of your graveyard. It gives target creature you control +2/+0 until end of turn, and that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. So I mean, a bite spell that also gives +2 power for only 2 mana is actually super good. You do need the evidence to collect, and that makes it a little swingy. But even if this is just half the time 4 mana and half the time 2 mana, depending on the board state you're in, depending on the game, I think that's good enough to include. If this is an average of 3 mana for this ability, at common, I think that's pretty good, and I think this will be a good choice of a card to kind of like fill out your deck if you're a little light on removal. Make sure you get to enough removal cards, have a nice removal package. So in Limited, I think this is a pretty good pick. Next up, we've got Case of the Locked Hothouse. This card is bananas. 1 green and 3 for an enchantment case. As soon as it hits the battlefield, you may play an additional land on each of your turns, and that is including the turn that you play Case of the Locked Hothouse, which is important to note because you could theoretically play this on 4, play a land, and still play a 1-drop. Now, to solve it, you have to control 7 or more lands, and then when it is solved, you may look at the top card of your library anytime, and you may play lands and cast creature and enchantment spells from the top of your library. This is incredibly powerful when you realize you don't lose the first ability once you gain that second ability because it's solved. At that point, you have both. So not only can you play things from the top of your library, but you can play 2 lands a turn from the top of your library, which is just gnarly. You're not going to hit those same kind of snags that cards like this typically draw you into. So you can just start ripping cards and not really worry about running out of gas every turn, as long as you build your deck appropriately where it has a very high threshold of creatures and enchantments. But it's just so good. Not only that, but I see a line here where you like play this on 4, play your 1 untapped land, and now you have 5, and then that's the last land that you need to turn like a Leyline Binding into a 1 mana flash spell so that you can also play a Leyline Binding the same turn. Because I think the biggest downside to a card like this is having to take a turn off and do nothing in order to play it. You allow your opponent to get a huge tempo advantage. So being able to follow this up with the land and then being able to use that land for something as significant as playing a Leyline Binding right away makes this card a lot better than it otherwise would be. And then once you get to that solve state, it's just pure gasoline. Next up, we've got Case of the Trampled Garden. 1 green and 2 for an enchantment case. When it enters the battlefield, you distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures you control. So a little under rate there. You're getting 2 counters for 3 mana. It's pretty slow. To solve it, creatures you control have to have a total power 8 or greater. So that counts all of your power on the board, which is really, really nice. You don't have to worry about getting a specific creature high enough. You just need enough creature density that you get there. And then once it is solved, whenever you attack, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains trample until end of turn. This reminds me a lot of Ranger class. It's a little bit more expensive and does a little less initially than Ranger class, so I don't know if it's going to be quite as playable, but that ability is valuable, and the fact that you get something in the meantime with the 2 +1/+1 counters you can distribute is not nothing. I think in Limited, this will be a pretty decent card if you are running a more than average number of creatures and you're very creature heavy, very creature dense. I think this can be worth it in Limited, although it is tricky to play this over removal or over just more creatures to go wide with, so it's kind of hard to decide if that's the right call, but it is worth trying. I think in Constructed it's just going to end up being too slow. Next up, we've got Chalk Outline. 1 green and 3 for an enchantment. Whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, you create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token and then investigate. This card's kind of bananas. There's a couple things I want to point out. First of all, you get a 2/2 and investigate. It's not like an or. Getting both of those is pretty nutty off something leaving your graveyard that might not even cost you any mana to do that, right? But the fact that this can trigger multiple times a turn is what really makes it crazy. Now, it's important to note, it does only trigger once if a bunch of creatures leave at the same time to like the same ability or whatever. But if you're able to get separate triggers to remove creature cards separately from your graveyard one at a time, every single one of them is going to give you a 2/2 and a clue token. That's a lot of card advantage and a lot of board presence over time if you're able to actually plan your deck around that and consistently pull it off. So I'm really interested in trying this in standard with something like Willowgeist. My Geist deck is already pretty gnarly and can do some pretty wild things, so adding this into the mix could be really cool. In fact, there's a lot of cards in this set that are going to be really good for Geist, so look forward to that deck for sure. Next up, we've got Culvert Ambusher, a 4/5 Worm Horror for 2 green and 3. When it enters the battlefield or is turned face up, target creature blocks this turn if able, and it has Disguise for 1 green and 4. So there's versatility here. You can just top deck it and slam it as a 4/5 for 5 if you want, or you can be a little more slow roll it, play it as a 2/2 Ward 2 for 3, and then at some point later on flip it for the combat trick, get a little bit of value. I think this guy is fine. I like that the Disguise cost only takes 1 green, so makes him a lot more splashable. You know, the fact that you can play it as a colorless creature and it only takes 1 specific color to flip it eventually down the line. Very easy to just splash this guy and then flip him up when you happen to draw into your green. Next up, we've got Fanatical Strength, 1 green and 1 for an instant. Target creature gets +3/+3 and gains trample until end of turn. Nothing special to see here. This is your typical combat trick for limited. If you're short on removal or combat tricks, you're going to want to pick one of these up if you can and run it alongside your removal suite. But other than that, nothing to write home about. Next up, we've got Flourishing Bloomkin. This card's kind of nutty. 1 green and 1 for a 0/0/0 plant elemental. It gets +1/+1 for each forest you control. And then it has Disguise for 1 green and 4. When Flourishing Bloomkin is turned face up, search your library for up to 2 forest cards and reveal them. Put one of them onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand and then shuffle. This card is nuts. Being able to have the versatility of playing it as a 2/2 on turn 2 for 2 mana that grows every turn if you're in Monogreen. So by turn 4 it's a 4/4, turn 5 it's a 5/5. If your Rampant lands out quicker, it's even bigger quicker. That's kind of cool. The scalability here is pretty wild. But you have this alternate mode as well where you can just play it in as a 2/2 with Ward 2 and then at some point later on flip it and fetch the forest cards you need to not only go even bigger with the Bloomkin, but also to ramp into more high cost spells that you're looking to play with your deck. So I think that versatility makes it pretty strong. What I'm really excited about is the idea of using this with a card called Leyline of the Guild Pack, which we'll get to that in the multicolor set review. But I've got a deck in mind that's going to be pretty insane, and I'll give you guys a couple hints on what that is when we get to the multicolor set review. But it's coming. Get ready for it. I think this card is pretty bananas. It's also worth noting that it works super well with Awaken the Woods, because all of those token creatures you make with Awaken the Woods they count as a forest. So this thing just gets super huge, probably doubles in size when you cast Awaken the Woods, which is just kind of nuts. Next up here we got Get a Leg Up. 1 green mana for an instant. Until end of turn, target creature gets +1/+1 for each creature you control and gains reach. So normally a card like this, I'm a little wary of requiring a big board to be good, because if your opponent happens to wipe you or whatever, it makes the card super bad. But the fact that this gives reach as well, and no matter what, you're at least going to have that one creature you're targeting out, so you'll at least get the +1/+1. That's not that bad. You know, if the floor of this is just 1 mana instant speed, gives something +1/+1 in reach, like, that's not amazing, but as the worst possible scenario, that's actually not that bad, and it can only get better from there. So I think if you are playing a limited archetype that's able to go really wide with creatures, this card kind of becomes a no-brainer and can get really good. In Constructed, it's a little tricky because sweepers are everywhere, but in Limited, I do think this sees play. Next up, we have Glintweaver, a 3/3 spider with reach for 2 green and 5. That's a lot. When it enters the battlefield, you distribute 3 +1/+1 counters among 1, 2, or 3 target creatures, and then you gain life equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control. So this guy is pretty gnarly. At the very least, he can come in as a 6/6 reach that gains you 6 life. Which, I mean, for 7 mana is still a lot. But that's a big body and a decent amount of life, so that's nothing to scoff at. The fact that you can distribute those counters separately and potentially gain even more life if you have an even bigger creature out, just makes the ceiling on this that much higher. But where I really think this card shines is in a deck that's looking to like surveil and maybe collect evidence. Because if you come across this early, you can surveil it into your graveyard, and then it is a whopping 7 evidence for collecting evidence, which is huge. And if you don't come across it early, you can just top deck it later when you have your 7 mana so that you can play it. So I think in a set like this that's looking to utilize collect evidence and has mechanics like surveil in it, something like this is a little bit more playable because you can sort of go in that direction if you get it too early when you don't have enough mana, and that adds value to what the card can do rather than it just being a do nothing until you get to 7. So consider it for those specific decks. Next up we have Green Belt Radical, 1 green and 3 for a 4/4 Centaur Citizen. Disguises for 2 green and 5. And when it's turned face up, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and creatures you control gain trample until end of turn. What an interesting card. I'll drink to that. So, I mean, at the very least here, you can just jam this as a 4/4 for 4, and that's not awful, right? But if you are ramping, if it is later in the game and you're top decking this, you have the ability to just kind of disguise it out as a 2/2 with Ward 2. That's hard for your opponent to deal with because of the Ward. And that helps you to kind of save this combat trick. And then if you do have the mana, you can flip this and just basically get a mini overrun, except the +1/+1 stays forever because it's in the form of counters. And it's also worth noting that it hits itself. And that makes it a little bit better than it otherwise would look. And I think that's why it costs 7 to flip this thing. Because if you put it onto the battlefield earlier in the game as a ward creature, the turn you flip this, it doesn't have Summoning Sickness. Flipping it does not make it exile, leave play, and come back. So it is the same card. It has still been in play. It turns up, and all creatures you control get +1/+1 counters and gain trample. So this immediately becomes a 5/5 trampler that is able to swing in, as well as buffing up all of your other creatures and giving them trample. And I think that's the part that's easy to overlook. So I think all of that as extra gravy on the back of just a 4/4 for 4 is pretty fine. And I think this is actually going to be a pretty high pick, not like a first pick for green, but a decently high pick in decks that are able to ramp and at least consider that 7 mana. Next up, we have Hard-Hitting Question. 1 green for a sorcery. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. Very simple card here. 1 mana, bite spell, no buffs, just bite. No bark, just bite. I think it's a pretty cool card. It's going to be better in a deck that has high power. It's going to be better in a deck with Death Touchers, of course. In fact, if you're running like a Death Touch tribal deck in Constructed, this might actually be removal of choice for a deck like that because it's just so cheap and Death Touch creatures are just going to automatically kill something, and it's not a fight spell, so you won't lose your Death Touch creatures. So that's something to take into account, but even just in Limited here, I do think this card is pretty good as removal for just 1 mana. Not as good as my coffee, though. Nectar of the Gods. Next up, we've got Hedge Whisperer. 1 green for a 0/3 Elf Druid Detective. You may choose not to untap him during your untap step. You can also pay 1 green and 3, tap him, and collect evidence 4, and target land you control becomes a 5/5 green plant boar creature with haste for as long as Hedge Whisperer remains tapped. It's still a land, activate only as a sorcery. I really like cards like this. The fact that this can come down as a pretty decent blocker on turn 1 until you're ready to do the thing makes it pretty cool. But then, like, every time you have collect evidence 4, you can just turn a land into a 5/5 and just start smashing in for 5. And if they remove the creature, all you have to do is collect evidence 4 again and turn another land into a 5/5. And that makes it a little bit better than if the Hedge Whisperer itself had been a 5/5 creature, because unless they have a way to kill a creature outside of combat and get rid of this Hedge Whisperer, you're constantly swinging in with a 5/5 land, and when they kill it, you can just make another one. And if they don't kill it, you don't have to spend any more mana or collect any more evidence at all. It just stays a 5/5 for as long as you want, as long as you keep this guy tapped. And then eventually when they do kill it, you untap them, you make another one. So it kind of gives endless gas to the top end of like an aggro deck, while being a very defensive card early in the game, which is a really interesting juxtaposition. I think this guy's going to be super good in Limited. Keep your eye on him for sure. Constructed, it's possible. I think he's a little slow for what he's trying to do in Constructed specifically, but it's possible. But Limited for sure, he's gonna be really good. Next up, we've got Hide in Plain Sight. This might be my favorite green card of the set. 1 green and 3 for a sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You get to cloak 2 of them, and then you put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So what this essentially does is for 4 mana, you get 2 2/2 creatures. Each of them has Ward 2. That alone is pretty decent, but you get to cloak anything you want. If you happen to cloak a creature, you're then able to later on flip that creature face up by paying its mana cost, which is even more value. But if that wasn't enough, the way that I want to use this card is by cloaking non-creature permanents or really, really big creatures like Atraxa. But more importantly, non-creature permanents, something like a Portal to Phyrexia. And then use flicker effects. So if a Portal to Phyrexia is cloaked, or an Atraxa, or an Atali, or whatever, you flicker that creature. It's a 2/2 creature. Target it with any flicker spell that can target a creature, and that card's going to leave play, come back as the front side. Could you imagine just for 2 mana after playing something like this, you flicker one of those cards and it comes back as a Portal to Phyrexia? Your opponent has to sacrifice 3 creatures, and then you have a Portal to Phyrexia just doing work for you every turn? That sounds bananas. I'm looking to break Cloak in a big way, specifically with flicker effects, and I think this card might be a big part of that, so keep your eyes peeled for that because that deck is coming, but I think this card is absolutely bananas. Even without doing those crazy tricks, it's still going to be good, whether it's Limited or Constructed. I think this card is absolutely playable, definitely in Limited. If you're not doing the flicker trick, it's hard to say in Constructed, but it even has a chance in Constructed outside of the flicker thing, because it's almost like a collected company at the same time, right? If you hit 2 good creature hits in those top 5 cards, it's almost it's like a 4 mana collected company in a way, even though it's going to cost you more mana over the next couple turns to actually turn those 2/2 Ward 2s into those creatures. The potential is still there, so as far as card advantage, it's a lot like a collected company, and that just makes it really interesting, in my opinion. Next up, we have Loxodon Eavesdropper. This is a 3/3 Elephant Detective for 1 green and 3. When it enters the battlefield, you investigate, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, Loxodon Eavesdropper gets +1/+1 and Vigilance until end of turn. I think this guy's pretty decent. I mean, the fact that he's a 3/3 body that also replaces himself by drawing with a clue token later on seems pretty decent, but the fact that you can get extra value off this guy by cracking a clue token during your, pre-combat main phase, and he's a 4/4 Vigilance swinging in for the 4 mana you paid. If you can just swing in a couple times like that, he's absolutely worth the mana investment alongside getting a clue token out of him, which is kind of bananas. So as far as commons go, if you're in a deck that's able to draw a second card, has enough clue tokens, and you're able to do that at least somewhat consistently, like every other turn or something, the potential for this card to be great is totally there, and it's going to be much better than a lot of the other commons in that scenario. This card is Nervous Gardener, 1 green and 1 for a 2/2 Dryad, has Disguise for 1 green, And when it's turned face up, you search your library for a land card with a basic land type, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. It's cool because this guy can find the new dual lands that have the basic land types, or it can find the Triome 3-color lands from New Capenna. So there's a lot of versatility in what you can grab with Nervous Gardener, and I think that makes it a little bit better than it otherwise would be. But it also might just be a little too expensive. It's nice that you can just play it as a 2/2. But if you really want to get the value off of it and get that land, you have to spend a total of 4 mana, which might be fine or it might be too much. It's hard to say, but it's at least worth considering. I think for limited, this is going to be a really good way of mana fixing in a base green deck. So as a common way for base green to find your splash colors, I think this is actually a really good card because it's also tacked on to just a 2/2 for 2. So getting a relevant body alongside your mana fixing is going to be pretty good. So definitely grab one of these late if you need fixing and you're coming up short and you're in base green. Next up, we've got Pick Your Poison. Everyone's kind of talking about this card. I don't think it's quite as good as they're making it out to be, but it's still a great card. 1 green for a sorcery, and you choose one. Each opponent sacrifices an artifact. Each opponent sacrifices an enchantment. Each opponent sacrifices a creature with flying. Now, 1 mana for 3 separate modes, 3 separate things this can kill, on the surface just looks bananas, right? But you have to remember, they're sacrificing it, so you're not able to choose. If they have a clue token and a really bomby artifact, they can just sack the clue token, right? Same things with enchantments, same things with creatures with flying. If they have 2 creatures with flying, they can just sacrifice the worst one. If they don't have any creatures with flying, like, you hold on to this until they get a clue token and you make them sack the clue token, but that maybe they sack the clue token in response, you know? So the versatility here is really nice, and every once in a while the sacrifice will be an upside because it can get rid of things that might have hexproof or ward or whatever. But I think a lot of the time that sacrifice is going to be a detriment, and I don't think at the end of the day this card is as good as everyone is ranting and raving about, but you should still definitely keep it in mind. It's a pretty fine inclusion if your green deck is a little light on removal and limited. Next up, we've got Pompous Gadabout. I hope I pronounced that right. A 4/2 human citizen for 1 green and 2. He has hexproof as long as it's your turn, and he can't be blocked by creatures that don't have a name. So this whole don't have a name thing, I think it's basically token creatures. Token creatures, if I'm understanding this correctly, token creatures and then any kind of disguised, cloaked, morph style creatures. None of those creatures have names, they just have creature types. So I think this won't be able to be blocked by creature tokens and disguised creatures, which makes it a little bit better than it otherwise would be, I think. And the fact that it also has hexproof on your turn makes it interesting as well. It means if he survives a turn cycle and he's still there on your turn, they really kind of have to kill it in combat. And it has 4 power, so they're probably having to trade with it, right? Seems pretty interesting. The 2 toughness is a little bit mitigated by the fact that they can't block it with tokens or ward creatures, so they have to block it and trade probably with something that's a little bit better than that, which is kind of nice. Now, if this doesn't work for tokens the way I'm thinking and it's just the disguised creatures, that makes this card significantly worse. But as long as we get the tokens and the disguised creatures, I think this guy's actually pretty interesting. Moving on. Rope. 1 green for an artifact clue equipment. It equips for 3, gives a equipped creature +1/+2, reach, and they can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. And then you can also pay 2 mana and sacrifice the rope to draw a card. Now, you guys already know how I feel about these clue equipments. I think they're more useful than they otherwise would be, because you can sack them to draw a card if you don't have a creature to equip them to. If you're out of creatures, you're out of gas, normally an equipment would be a dead card. but in this case, it isn't. You can at least sack it, draw a card, try to get closer to your next creature, that sort of thing. As far as equipments go, +1, +2, and reach, and can't be blocked by more than one creature is kind of a lot for one. So I think it's pretty decent. I mean, the equip 3 cost is a bit much, but there's a lot of versatility there. You can use it defensively, buffs up the toughness and gives it reach. You can use it aggressively and make it so it's a lot harder for your opponent to block your creature. Another really good combo is if you're in a sort of like a suspect deck where you're playing a lot of suspect creatures, if you can equip rope to a creature that is suspected, it can't be blocked by more than one creature, but it has menace, so it can't be blocked by just one creature, so it just becomes unblockable. It's cool that the rope equipment turns any suspected creature into an unblockable creature, and you're going to want to keep that in mind. If you are drafting into the suspected archetype, if for some reason that ends up being the direction you're going and you have a lot of high quality suspected cards, this is absolutely up for consideration to be included in that deck, and the value of this card just goes way up in a deck like that, so keep that in mind. Next up we have Rubblebelt Maverick, a 1/1 human detective for 1 green. When he enters the battlefield, you surveil 2, and you can pay 1 green and exile him from your graveyard to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, but activate only as a sorcery. This is another card where I think it's a little bit better than it looks. If you're in that deck that wants to surveil, that wants to collect evidence, being able to get incidental surveil value is pretty good on your 1/1 that you don't mind chumping with or trading with, because you're going to get extra value with it later on by using it to put a counter on something while it's in the graveyard. So in any kind of deck that's looking to sacrifice creatures, this could be good fodder for that. Any kind of deck that's looking to utilize collect evidence and surveil mechanics, this is going to be pretty good for that, get you some extra value. Also, if this guy himself is surveilled into the graveyard, you're able to get a little extra value there by getting the +1/+1 counter by using him when he's in your graveyard. So there's a lot of little ways for him to be used. You're going to want to be in the right archetype for it though, but if you are, he's a pretty decent inclusion. Next up we've got Sample Collector. This is a 2/3 troll detective for 1 green and 2. When he attacks, you may collect evidence 3. When you do, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. The fact that this triggers every time you attack is pretty good. That means this guy could be swinging in as a 3/4 because you can choose to put that first counter on him. So as long as you at least have enough evidence to collect evidence 3 the first time, he's kind of a 3/4 for 3. He's a 3/4 for 3 that if you manage to get even more cards into your graveyard later on that you can use for collecting evidence, can get even bigger or can make your other creatures even bigger. And when you start to think of him along those lines, he actually looks a lot better, because at first glance, a 2/3 for 3, regardless of what abilities it has, seems a little bit meh, right? But I think in Limited, this guy's actually going to kind of be a powerhouse if you're in the right deck and you're able to set up with enough collect evidence material. You're really kind of able to go to town with this guy, and the fact that he can distribute those +1/+1 counters onto any creatures, not just himself or not just a particular creature over and over, really adds to just how good this guy could potentially be up at the ceiling. So better than he looks. Definitely consider running him if you're in that kind of deck that's looking to provide plenty of cards in the graveyard to collect evidence with. Next up we have Sharp-Eyed Rookie, 1 green and 1 for a 2/2 human detective with vigilance. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if its power is greater than Sharp-Eyed Rookie's power, or its toughness is greater than Sharp-Eyed Rookie's toughness, you put a +1/+1 counter on Sharp-Eyed Rookie and investigate. I think this guy is awesome. It's a 2/2 vigilance for 2, and even if you only get the ability to trigger once, that turns it into a 3/3 vigilance for 2 that gave you a clue token back to replace itself. And that is just bananas. So if you can jam this on 2 and just follow it up with a 3/2 or a 2/3 and get that counter and that clue token, you are way ahead of the game as far as tempo is concerned, and you are going to town. So I really like this guy. I think he's going to be amazing in limited. Obviously, he's a rare, but I think he might see some play in constructed. I'll say this much: if the detective tribal type actually ends up having a standard constructed deck that is competitive, that's decent, I would not be surprised to see this guy be a part of it, because it's pretty wild, and there's plenty of detective synergies that he slots into. Next up, we've got the card everyone's talking about, Slime Against Humanity. I'll drink to that. One green and 2 for a sorcery. You make a 0/0 green ooze creature token with trample, and then you put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is 2 plus the total number of cards you own in exile and in your graveyard that are oozes or are named Slime Against Humanity. A deck can have any number of cards named Slime Against Humanity. Where do I even start with this card? First of all, it's really cool that it counts other oozes and not just how many cards are Slime Against Humanity. So you can brew a deck where you're able to kind of get a little bit of extra value off other oozes that you're running as well, without slowing down the ability for your Slime Against Humanity cards to grow just as quick, which is kind of nice. But I think where this gets really wild is it says cards you own in exile and in your graveyard. So if you're able to self-mill or self-exile a ton of cards, you can just make a huge trampler out of nowhere for only 3 mana. And I think that could be kind of wild. Imagine using, there's a black 3 mana tutor that exiles like 13 cards and then lets you search your deck for any card. Imagine running that, and imagine if just half of those cards were Slime Against Humanities, you know, and you hit like 7 of them. Like, your Slime Against Humanities are going to start coming down as 10/10 tramples for 3 mana, and you tutored up a card. Like, that seems kind of bananas. So I definitely think there's ways to sort of not so much break this card, but definitely bend the hell out of it. And it'll be interesting trying to explore those options and see if it can be a real deck. I'm super interested in it. In draft, it's going to be a little hard. If you can manage to get all of the Slime Against Humanities that are going around, which is possible because psychologically everyone might be assuming they won't be able to get enough Slime Against Humanities, so they don't grab any of them. And maybe you're the one player that is actually trying, so then like you get them all. And if you end up with all of them in an 8-person draft pod, that might be pretty wild in limited. Hopefully the opportunity to do that in limited comes up for us, because that would be super fun. Next up, we've got the Pride of 𝐂𝐻𝐈𝐻. Holy Shimoly, a 2/15 legendary crocodile elk turtle for 1 green and 10. Holy moly. It costs X less to cast, where X is the total toughness of creatures you control. It has a defender, and it also has the ability to pay 2 blue and 2, and until end of turn, target creature you control gets +1/+0, and gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw cards equal to its toughness. And it can attack as though it didn't have defender. This is a lot to unpack. Obviously, this card's going to be great in an Arcades style toughness matters deck, where everything is attacking and dealing damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. This can come out super cheap for just 1 green mana if you're going wide quick enough. This card works super well with Bedrock Tortoise, which is an 0/6 and lets everything use their toughness size as their power instead of using their power as their power. So there's definitely ways to break this, right? But the fact that you could potentially pay 4 mana and swing in with this guy and draw 15 cards is nuts. There's got to be a way to abuse him and his ability with something like Bedrock Tortoise, and then combine both of those cards with like the power 2 matters archetype, because there's a bunch of cards in this set that care about creatures that have power 2 or less. And those cards are all kind of balanced by the idea that, like, okay, if the creature has power 2 or less, it can't do a whole lot of damage in combat. But you can get around that by doing the Bedrock Tortoise thing. So if you're able to use, like, the card advantage of all of these power 2 matters cards with the huge asses of something like Pride of Hellclade and Bedrock Tortoise and other cards that might slot into that, and then also have the ability to potentially draw a ton of cards with this activation here, like, that just seems like a ton of synergy that is ripe to explore. So I think at some point we're going to try and brew that. It just seems kind of wild. And not for nothing, a 2/15 for 11 mana is just nuts. Next up is They Went This Way. 1 green and 2 for a sorcery. You search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. You also investigate. I think the fact that you investigate makes this a little bit better than it might appear. 3 mana to ramp something into the battlefield tapped. Mana fix you and ramp you is sort of par of the course, but getting potential card advantage later on because of the clue token alongside that, still at the 3 mana cost, is pretty good, I think. Like, a lot of these cards that do typical set mechanic thing, but also give you a clue token as well, I think they're all a little bit better than they otherwise would be, because they just replace themselves over the course of the entire game. And even though you got to kind of draw out the game to take advantage of that and get the value off those clue tokens, I feel like the limited environment for Murders at Karlov Manor is a lot slower paced. You have main set mechanics based around, you know, playing a 2/2 for 3 mana, being Disguise, or the power 2 or less matters theme, which typically sees creatures with power 2 or less like underrate for the amount of mana that you're paying for them. So I am tempted to say this is going to be a slower format. So cards like this that do the normal thing that don't seem very special but also give you a clue token go way up in value if the format's really slow. So this could be a real contender. At the very least, it is a common way for green to mana fix you so that you can go into multicolor. Next up, we've got Topiary Panther. Speaking of ways to mana fix, this is 2 green and 4 for a 6/5 trampler. That's a big plant cat. But the way it will usually be used is basic land cycling 1 green and 1. So you can cycle this thing away as long as you're in base green and you have your green. Fetch any basic land you want to fix yourself, and make sure you don't miss a land drop. And I think what's easily overlooked about this card as well is it's so easy to get into your graveyard with that basic land cycling ability. And then once it's in your graveyard, it has a whopping 6 mana cost that counts towards Collect Evidence. So this card is a no-brainer in the Collect Evidence deck for sure. Keep it in mind. But it's also nice that the card that does that can also just be like top deck later in the game. Oh, 6/5 with Trample. Just windmill slam it on the board, and if my opponent doesn't deal with it, I can probably use it to win. So having both of those modes on the same card, pretty darn good for a common. So I think this card is going to go really high. So grab them while you can before they're gone in the draft. Next up, we've got Tunnel Tipster. 1 green and 1 for a 1/1 Mole Scout. At the beginning of your end step, if a face-down creature entered the battlefield under your control this turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on Tunnel Tipster. You can also tap it to add 1 green mana. The bummer here is I really wish this was a mana dork that helped you get the 3 mana for a Disguise creature, a face-down creature, to be played a turn earlier on turn 2. And that it lined up with like the normal mana dork things you'd want to do. The way it is right now, you have to play this on 2, and then you can still play your face down creature on 3, and you just have this extra mana to use on something else, and it's a little bit unintuitive because of that. But at the end of the day, I mean, a 1/1 mana dork for 2 that's also just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as you play face down creatures could still be really good, even if curve-wise, it doesn't really line up the way I want it to. Especially if you're in base green and you're just playing a ton of disguise creatures, because green can just search out whatever color you happen to need with its, you know, basic land search and its mana fixing to flip whatever you happen to have in play, whatever colors you need to flip them. Incentivizes like using a base green 4 or 5 color deck with a whole bunch of different color disguise guys and a card like this, maybe a couple copies of something like this to get really big because you're playing a bunch of disguise guys. Something like that could be a real thing. We're gonna have to try it out and see if it's worth it. Next up, we have Undergrowth Recon. This card is absolutely bananas. 2 green and 1 for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now, at first glance, this seems super slow. You have to figure out ways to get lands into your graveyard, right? You play this on 3, and then you don't get a land until your upkeep on turn 4, but then that land comes into play tapped, so you don't actually get to use that land for mana until turn 5. So you spent your entire turn 3 playing Undergrowth Recon, and you don't have anything to show for it until turn 5, really? So that makes it seem a little iffy. But when you realize that the new Capenna fetch lands are still in Standard, and that those lands put themselves in the graveyard automatically when you play them, all of a sudden this starts to look a million times better, because on turn 1 you're playing one of those new Capenna fetch lands and it's going to the graveyard, and then on turn 3 when you play Undergrowth Recon, the fetch land is there ready to grab. You don't have to jump through any hoops, and then when it does come into play at the beginning of your upkeep, comes into play, fetches another land, and then goes right back to the graveyard so that you can do it again the next turn. So it's super easy to turn on the ability to just get a land every single turn. But more importantly than that, you're not just getting a land every single turn. You're getting a land by bringing back a land that fetches a land. So you're getting 2 landfall triggers, right? You're getting 2 landfall triggers plus a third one if you have a land to play for the turn. That's 3 landfall triggers in one turn without having to spend any mana every single turn. 3 landfall triggers every single turn for 0 mana. So maybe, as far as the actual ramp deck, the way it looks these days in Standard, this might not make the cut, but there's gotta be a new deck out there that really centers on landfall triggers and Tatyova and synergistic things with that this card is absolutely busted in, right? Like 3 landfall triggers a turn for free for no mana as part of an enchantment that's hard to remove because it's not like it's a creature that they can use creature removal on. Like, that just seems like that's gotta be worth trying, right? Maybe we can finally make the Tatyova landfall deck a thing. I've been trying to for so long. This card definitely needs to be included in that, so we're gonna give it a whirl. But I think at the end of the day, in the right deck, that's not necessarily the same 5-color deck the way it looks right now in Standard, this could be pretty significant. Next up, we've got Vengeful Creeper. 1 green and 4 for a 5/5 plant elemental with disguise 1 green and 5. When it is turned face up, you destroy target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. I think this is pretty good at common. Honestly, if your plan B is a common that's just a 5/5 for 5, right? That is easily splashable and only takes the 1 green. Like, for a plan B, that's really good. Plan A is you just play it for 3 colorless even if you don't have green yet. And then it's a 2/2 ward 2, and then at some point later in the game, it flips up into a 5/5 and also kills their best artifact or enchantment. I think having those different modes, those different ways to play this card, depending on what kind of game you're playing, what the board state is like, makes this guy pretty effective. So for a common, I absolutely recommend giving him a whirl at your top end as a one of, because I think he's going to be that good. And then the last card for green is Vitu-Ghazi Inspector, a 1/3 elf detective for 1 green and 1. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may collect evidence 6. He has reach, and when Vitu-Ghazi Inspector enters the battlefield, if evidence was collected, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and you gain 2 life. This is another good example of how good and how playable commons are in this set. Like a 1/3 reach for 2 is not great, but it's not bad either. Like as the baseline, as the absolute floor, like that's fine, right? But the fact that if you have enough evidence collect, it's also throwing a +1/+1 counter somewhere and gaining you 2 life. It can effectively be a 2/4 reach that gains you 2 life for 2 mana. That's kind of crazy, right? I mean, you're only going to be able to play so many of these. You're only going to be able to collect evidence so many times. And you have to be careful to not have too many collect evidence cards without enough evidence to collect. But that's all balancing. At the end of the day, is the card good enough? Yeah. Like, that's kind of nutty. Like, that ability, if you have plenty of collect evidence and you're not, like, cutting off your ability to get a better collect evidence spell later on, then, like, yeah, this is, like, really great value. And the fact that that +1/+1 counter can just go somewhere else, if that ends up being better for you, makes it even better. So as a common that can fill out your deck if you're lacking cards, this card is nutty. And that is our set review for green. We have gone through all 5 colors now. Those videos are linked in the about section down below. Up next is colorless and then multicolor, and then we'll be closing everything off with my top 10 for constructed, my top 5 for limited, and then a video detailing 10 decks I'm looking to brew, which you guys can vote on. If you become a patron over at patreon.com/quarantinecapricorn, even at just the $1 tier, you get to vote on my 10 brews that I'm excited about, what order I do them in, and we'll be doing one of them each day after launch for the first 10 days after the set is out. So head on over there, join the Patreon, vote on, the vote's going to go live probably Monday, I think, is when the vote will go live. So if you're interested in that and you really want to see a particular deck right off the bat and don't want to wait a week and a half to see it, head on over there, just sign up for $1, and you can vote on which ones you want to see first. So I'll see you guys then. The next set review is on its way. Until then. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.